Hey guys, tonight we step out onto the Giza plateau together, like you've somehow wandered into a moonlit open-air museum that forgot to install the ropes and signs. The sand looks silver. The stones look almost blue. The air feels cool enough to make you pull your shoulders up even if you're listening under a blanket. And right in front of you, the pyramids sit there with that calm, unmoving confidence, like they know you're about to ask a question people have been asking for a long time. Were the pyramids truly built by the Egyptians, or is the story more tangled than the postcard version? Here's the deal for tonight, nice and gentle. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination? Because you and I are allowed to wonder without turning wonder into certainty. We'll use cautious words because historians debate, and because your brain deserves soft edges before sleep. Also, you probably won't survive this, in the sense that if you tried to build a pyramid tomorrow, you would last about 12 minutes and then demand a snack and better shoes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love imagining this as one big quiet campfire across time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand where tourists usually shuffle, but in your mind it's quieter. The crowd noise fades until you can hear only the wind rubbing sand against stone. The pyramid rises in front of you like a frozen slope of night, and you can almost feel how each block holds the day's heat, letting it out slowly, breath by breath, as if the monument is exhaling. Most historians agree that the Great Pyramid and its famous neighbours belong to Egypt's Old Kingdom, especially the 4th dynasty, a time when royal power is strong enough to command resources at an enormous scale. Archaeology suggests that the landscape around you, from quarries to work areas, fits that kind of state project. The evidence we do have points to people, tools and systems that make a pyramid possible without needing a magical shortcut. And yet, even while you're standing on that solid ground, the question still hums. Because one interpretation is that the story we inherit can blur, not necessarily because anyone is lying, but because time loves to smudge handwriting. Names get repeated. Legends become smoother than the messy reality. And what if the wind itself is hiding a missing page? Not a page that says aliens did it, or something dramatic like that. Just a page that explains a boring detail everyone would love to know. Like which supervisor yelled the most, or how many blisters you get when you push a sledge in sand. You take a slow step closer and your brain does the normal modern thing. It tries to compare this to your own life. You imagine a construction site, but you imagine cranes and neon safety vests, and somebody holding a clipboard like it's a sacred object. Then you remember you're in the Old Kingdom. The sacred object is not a clipboard, it's the king. It's the idea that order and balance and a properly maintained universe matters. A pyramid is not just a building, it's a statement in stone. That's mainstream ground. That's the kind of thing most historians agree is part of the context. But context still leaves you with the practical itch. How does belief turn into blocks? You look up at the face of the pyramid. In your imagination, the casing stones are still there, smooth limestone that would have made the whole thing shine in sunlight, almost like a bright geometric mountain. What's broadly accepted is that much of that smooth outer casing was taken away over centuries for other building projects, leaving the rougher inner stones exposed. If you treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can picture a city pulling from an older monument like a quarry of history, not because they hate the past, but because stone is stone, and a lot of people in every era will recycle anything that isn't bolted down. That includes giant monuments, apparently. Humans are consistent that way. It's comforting in a weird way. You angle your gaze toward the plateau and imagine the place as it might have been during construction. This is where you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that there's good reason to place the Great Pyramid's construction within the reign of Kufu, also known by a Greek version of his name as Cheops. Archaeology suggests that the surrounding pyramid complex, including nearby structures and the broader pattern of royal building, fits that era. And now the mist. Historians still argue whether the surviving bits of text and later accounts capture the real personality of Kufu, or whether he's been turned into a symbol in stories written long after he's gone. Some later tales paint him as harsh, others leave him vague. That matters because people sometimes take a scary story about a king and then use it to imagine scary explanations for how he built. But a more cautious explanation could be that powerful states can organise enormous labour without turning to fantasy, and that later storytellers simply enjoy dramatising the past. You let your eyes drift to the desert edge. Even at night you can sense the boundary where cultivated land would begin in ancient times, where water and crops mean life. In that world, the Nile is not just a river, it's a schedule, it's a calendar, it's a supply chain that floats. Most historians agree that ancient Egypt's ability to feed workers, move stone, and coordinate labour is tied to that river and the agricultural wealth it supports. The evidence we do have points to a society that can store grain, track deliveries, and command teams. And here's where your sleepy brain gets to enjoy a small dry joke. You think about how hard it is to coordinate a group chat for dinner plans, and then you imagine an Old Kingdom official coordinating thousands of people, and you decide the true miracle is not the pyramid. The true miracle is project management. Somewhere a stressed administrator is inventing the ancient version of a spreadsheet in his head. And if that doesn't make you want to lie down, nothing will. You begin to walk in your mind. Your sandals, if you're wearing them in this mental scene, scuff softly. The sand is cool. A faint smell of stone dust and dry air sits in your nose. You pass a block lying near a path, and you picture the shape of a tool mark. Archaeology suggests that ancient builders used stone, pounders, copper tools, and clever methods with wedges and friction to shape blocks. That's not the whole story yet, but it's part of the mainstream foundation. People did not need lasers, they needed time and technique, and a lot of repetitive effort. Now let's hold the mystery portion gently in your palm. A popular rumour claims that the pyramids are so precise they must have been made by a lost advanced civilization, or by outsiders, or by something not human. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it keeps returning because precision feels spooky when you don't know the methods behind it. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and the evidence for advanced forgotten machines is thin. It's suggestive, not conclusive, to point at precision and call it impossible. A more cautious explanation could be that skilled surveyors and masons doing the same tasks over and over can achieve results that surprise a modern casual observer. Let me rephrase that more carefully, because your brain might try to turn it into a slogan. It's not that everything is solved, it's that a lot can be explained without jumping to the furthest conclusion. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You pause. You rest your hand on a stone in your imagination. It feels gritty, not polished, because this is the exposed core. You think about how many hands touch these blocks. If you keep your focus on mainstream ground, you remember that archaeology suggests organised labour groups existed with roles, food supplies and housing. This isn't just a pile of enslaved strangers whipped into place, which is a common modern mental image. One interpretation is that the workforce included skilled labourers and rotating crews, people doing state service, people earning rations, people proud of the work, and also people under pressure because a state project is not optional. Human systems can be mixed like that. Pride and compulsion can live in the same campfire light. Historians still argue whether the best way to describe those workers is with words like paid conscripted or something in between. And that debate matters because the label changes the emotional story we tell ourselves about how a pyramid could exist. It's tempting to imagine only two options. Either everyone is a joyful volunteer singing while pushing blocks, or everyone is a chained captive in misery. Reality in most eras tends to be messier, and that mess is often the more believable explanation. You keep walking. The night is so quiet that you start to notice small sounds like the faint rasp of wind over stone or the soft whisper of your own breath. You try to picture the plateau during construction not as a dramatic movie set, but as a workplace. There are piles of rubble, there are stacks of tools, there are people arguing about angles, there are people carrying water and bread, there are supervisors calling out counts, and there are moments where someone sits down for a second, wipes sweat with a forearm, and stares at the rising shape with a tired kind of wonder. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Egypt had the social structure, the resources, and the tradition of monumental building. The interpreted part is how those human pieces felt to the people living them. And the gentle imagination is you standing under a moon, hearing the pyramid breathe out heat and asking, what if the story's pointing at something else? Because maybe the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. The names of most workers are lost. The day-to-day decisions are mostly silent. The The exact method for every stage might never be pinned down to one neat diagram, and that lack of neatness is what gives theories room to wander in. A fringe idea proposes that the pyramids encode secret messages, that they are energy devices, or that they alignments mean something far beyond ritual and symbolism. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still learn something from why it appeals. It appeals because the pyramids feel like they should be more than a tomb. They feel like a riddle, and humans love riddles because riddles make us feel like the universe has a key. But a cautious explanation could be that human beings build huge things for reasons that are both spiritual and political, and the result looks like a riddle because we're far away in time. You stop again and look up. In your mind, the stars are sharp. The pyramid's outline cuts into the sky like a calm, dark triangle. You realise the question you started with, were they truly built by the Egyptians, is partly a question about trust. Do you trust that a society without our machines can still achieve extraordinary results? Do you trust that slow and steady, repeated for decades, can create something that feels like it arrived overnight? The evidence we do have points to Egyptian involvement in planning and building. Most historians agree that. But you also allow yourself a softer thought. One interpretation is that the pyramid complex is not just a single moment, but a long process that involves many hands, many years, and perhaps changes we can't perfectly map. And what if the wind is hiding a missing page? Not because something supernatural happened, but because the most human details are the first to fade. You stand in that quiet. The sand cools your feet. The stone cools your palm. Your mind settles into the steady rhythm of the place. And as you breathe slowly, you let the pyramid be both a historical object and a midnight question, not solved, not proven, just held carefully. You keep walking, not fast, not in a hurry, because this isn't the kind of place you sprint unless you've dropped your phone into the sand and you're trying to rescue it before it becomes an artifact. The pyramid stays in your peripheral vision like a dark mountain that politely refuses to move. The fan hum in your room, or your own breath, if it's very quiet, becomes the steady background rhythm as your thoughts slide from the sheer presence of the stones to the question of names and dates. Most historians agree that the Great Pyramid belongs to the Old Kingdom, and more specifically to the 4th dynasty, which is basically ancient Egypt's era of big confidence and bigger budgets. Archaeology suggests that the overall pattern of pyramid building, from earlier stepped experiments to later true pyramids, forms a timeline of developing techniques rather than a sudden pop of impossible knowledge. The evidence we do have points to a sequence, a kind of architectural learning curve written in limestone and sweat. But you're not just here for a timeline, you're here for the paper trail, and ancient Egypt is both generous and stingy that way. Generous because they did leave writing behind. Stingy because it's not always the kind of writing you wish you had, like a neat little document titled How We Built the Great Pyramid Step by Step in Joy. If only. You imagine a scribe read pen in hand watching the progress and recording numbers. He's careful with the ink because ink is not free, and because the person reading this later might be powerful enough to make his life complicated. One interpretation is that official records, when they exist, may emphasize what a king once remembered and downplay the boring, messy parts. That's not a conspiracy, it's just how power tends to behave. And what if the real missing page is not hidden under sand, but hidden in plain sight, in the kind of record that survives only as a tally, a list, a receipt, a label, the ancient equivalent of a shipping manifest? Most historians agree that Kufu is the king most closely associated with the Great Pyramid. The evidence we do have points to that association through a combination of archaeological context and later historical tradition. And yet historians still argue whether every detail of attribution is as straightforward as popular summaries make it sound. Sometimes debate is about the edges, not the centre. The centre is that Khufu's era fits. The edges are the specifics of organisation, the timeline of phases, and which parts of the complex were completed when. You picture yourself stepping into a small museum room, the kind with soft lighting and glass cases. In your mind, there's a fragment of stone, a broken piece of an inscription, a name in a cartouche, that oval frame that makes royal names look official and important. Most historians agree that royal names and titles are a big deal in Egypt, not just decoration, but part of how authority is broadcast. Archaeology suggests that kings anchor projects, and projects reinforce kings like a loop that feeds itself. One interpretation is that monuments are not just for the afterlife, but for the living to see a way to say, I am legitimate, I am powerful, I can command the horizon. Now you let the cinematic what if drift in gently, like a curtain moving in a breeze. What if you could stand here on the day a royal decree is announced? Not because you need a dramatic scene, but because it helps you feel how decisions might travel through a society. You hear a messenger's voice, formal and rehearsed. You see officials nodding. You see a foreman calculating labour rotations in his head. And you see ordinary people doing what ordinary people always do when the state announces a giant plan. Some feel pride, some feel dread, some feel both at once. A careful reading might suggest that when later generations talk about pyramid building, they often focus on the king as if he alone builds it, when really a king is a symbol for a system. That system includes administrators, engineers, scribes, stonecutters, haulers, cooks, water carriers, and people whose job is basically to keep the whole place from turning into chaos. If you've ever watched one person try to organise a family holiday dinner, you understand why the true god of ancient Egypt might secretly be a scheduler with a strong personality. You step back out onto the plateau in your imagination and you look at the other pyramids nearby, the way they sit like a family of shapes. Archaeology suggests that pyramid building did not begin at Giza, and that there are earlier examples showing experiments and changes. Most historians agree that this matters because it suggests a tradition of building and learning rather than a single mysterious breakthrough. It's mainstream, calm, steady. You can almost feel the centuries of trial and improvement, like the slow sharpening of a tool. But if you're honest, your mind still wants the sharp, simple answer. Who built it? When exactly? How long did it take? And then your mind realizes it's asking ancient history to behave like modern paperwork, and ancient history just smiles quietly and refuses. Historians still argue whether the Great Pyramid took something like 2 decades or a bit more or less, because the exact timeline depends on assumptions about labour, size work seasons, and how quickly stones could be cut and moved. The evidence we do have points to large-scale organisation, but it doesn't hand us a stopwatch. A more cautious explanation could be that the project's duration is best described as plausible within a reign, without pretending we can know the month and day the final stone was set. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's not that scholars have no idea. It's that precision about the calendar can be difficult when records are incomplete. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now the mist, the part people love to wander into. A popular rumour claims that the pyramids are far older than the Old Kingdom, built by an unknown civilization, and later Egyptians merely stumbled upon them and claimed them. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it shows up often because it feels like it explains the awe. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and for that claim, the evidence is thin. Archaeology suggests strong cultural and architectural continuity in Egypt, leading up to the 4th dynasty, and the surrounding context at Giza fits a royal project rather than a random inheritance from a vanished world. Still, you can treat the rumour as a question rather than a conclusion. What would you need for it to be true? You would need strong signs of a much earlier construction phase, clear mismatch with Old Kingdom techniques, a trail of artifacts that don't fit, or a pattern of older dates that consistently point away from the accepted timeline. One interpretation is that when people ask for that kind of evidence, what they often find is not a clean alternative timeline, but a collection of ambiguities and gaps that feel bigger than they are. Gaps invite imagination. Imagination fills them with drama. And yet, you keep your tone gentle, because the goal tonight is not to dunk on anyone's curiosity. Curiosity is the whole reason you're here quietly listening. So you let yourself say, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the older civilization idea becomes a way to ask what we really know and what we only assume. It becomes an exercise in humility. Most historians agree that Egypt's state formation and agricultural wealth make big projects plausible. Archaeology suggests organised building traditions. The evidence we do have points to Egyptian authorship in planning and execution. That's the solid ground. But the solid ground still has pebbles, and those pebbles are the details that make sleep-friendly history feel alive. Like the fact that Egyptian kings had multiple names and titles, and later writers often used different versions, or the fact that later Greek and Roman visitors wrote about Egypt with fascination, sometimes blending observation and storytelling. Historians still argue whether some later descriptions preserve older oral traditions or simply reflect the biases of travellers who love a good dramatic tale. There's no full consensus on how much weight to give to any one later account, especially when it conflicts with other evidence. You stroll past the pyramid's base again, and in your mind, the stones are labelled not with modern museum tags, but with the invisible labels of bureaucracy. Crew A did this section, Crew B did that. Someone counted the bread, someone counted the beer, someone counted the days, someone complained about the sand in their sandals. That last one is not documented, but let's be honest, it's extremely likely. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the dynasty framework, the king's association, the tradition of monument building. The interpreted part is how power shaped the story told about the project. The gentle imagination is you picturing a missing page, not a magical secret, but a simple explanation written in a hand that never survived. A fringe idea proposes that the very absence of a single perfect building record is itself suspicious, as if secrecy must be involved. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's emotionally understandable. People want one clean document. A more cautious explanation could be that survival of ancient writing is uneven, and what survives is often what was copied, stored or carved into durable surfaces, not daily project notes on perishable materials. And what if the truth feels less mystical and more human? A king wants glory. A state wants stability. People want food and a future. Workers want rations and rest. Officials want to avoid being blamed if something goes wrong. Scribes want their ink to last and their bosses to stay pleased. The pyramid rises out of all of that stone stacked on the backs of ordinary motives until it becomes extraordinary. You slow your breathing, you let the night air in, you feel the gentle heaviness of the monument and the gentler uncertainty of history. You're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues, and the clue you carry forward now is simple. The names and dates we have are solid enough to stand on, but not so complete that they silence every question. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You drift onward with the kind of slow, careful attention you'd use in a dark hallway at night. Not because you're scared, but because you don't want to stub your toe on something embarrassing. The Giza plateau in your imagination is a wide open stage where the props are stone and the lighting is moon. The pyramid stays behind you now like a steady presence, and your mind begins to tug at a more practical thread. If Egyptians built this, where did all the stone come from? And how did it arrive here without turning the desert into a permanent traffic jam? Most historians agree that the pyramids were built from immense quantities of stone gathered from a mix of local and more distant sources. Archaeology suggests there are quarries close to Giza that provided much of the core material, and that higher quality limestone for the outer casing likely came from other areas transported by river. The evidence we do have points to quarry, scarce tool marks, and movement routes that make the supply chain feel less like magic and more like stubborn planning. You picture a quarry at dawn. The air is cool enough to feel pleasant for about 5 minutes, until the sun climbs and turns the stone face into a hot plate. Workers stand with stone pounders, chisels and wedges. You hear the sharp clack of rock against rock, and the softer dusty hush when a piece breaks free. One interpretation is that quarrying is not a single heroic act, but a steady rhythm of extraction, measuring, splitting, levering, and sorting repeated until your arms feel like they belong to someone else. And what if the real miracle is not moving a block, but deciding to move 10,000 blocks and then waking up the next day and doing it again? Archaeology suggests that when you look at the plateau and the nearby quarry areas, you can see signs of where stone was taken. The evidence we do have points to this kind of on-site supply, which makes sense because you would rather drag stone a short distance than a long one, unless the stone has a specific quality you need. Most historians agree that the core of the Great Pyramid uses local limestone, while the shiny casing stones, now mostly gone, were likely a finer limestone that could be dressed smooth. That's mainstream ground, and it's pretty satisfying because it answers part of the where question without requiring a secret tunnel from Atlantis. Now, historians still argue whether the exact mix of quarry sources and transport methods changed over time during construction, because a project this large likely adapts. You run out of a certain kind of stone nearby, you shift extraction. You discover a more efficient route, you use it. You learn where the bottlenecks are, you adjust the labour. The evidence we do have points to a living system, not a single frozen plan. You let your imagination follow the stone's journey. You see a block being levered onto a wooden sledge. You see men tightening ropes, testing the balance. Someone shouts a count. Someone else shouts back, probably complaining, because complaints are the universal human language. A careful reading might suggest that the real story of pyramids is the story of friction, not the metaphorical friction between theories, but actual friction between wood and sand and stone, and the constant battle to make heavy things slide where you want them. Most historians agree that transport along the Nile would have been a key advantage, especially for stone sourced farther away. Archaeology suggests ancient Egyptians used boats and barges for heavy loads, and used canals or channels to bring materials closer to building sites during high water seasons. The evidence we do have points to a society that understands how to harness water as a transportation system, because water is the original highway and it doesn't demand tolls or a car payment. There's a light joke hiding here, and it's this. Your modern brain hears logistics and thinks of shipping delays and tracking numbers, and someone telling you the package is out for delivery for 3 days. Meanwhile, an old kingdom administrator is basically running the world's largest delivery schedule with no GPS, no email, and probably a very grumpy donkey. If you can fall asleep after imagining that, congratulations, you have achieved true peace. You walk farther, and you imagine the edge of cultivated land again, where the desert meets green. Boats move on the river like dark shapes. The river smells of wet reeds and life. You see stone blocks stacked like silent passengers strapped down, moving slowly but surely. One interpretation is that when people underestimate ancient Egypt, they often forget how effective a river-based economy can be. If you have steady agriculture, you can support specialists. If you have specialists, you can plan. If you can plan, you can do big things. Historians still argue whether certain proposed canal routes or harbour setups near Giza looked exactly like some reconstructions suggest, because landscapes shift and not all traces survive. But the mainstream anchor remains. Archaeology suggests there were practical ways to get heavy materials near the plateau, and the evidence we do have points to water transport and staged delivery. Now, because we promised a 70% mainstream and 30% mystery balance, you allow the mist to drift in without taking over the room. A popular rumour claims that the stones were cast in place like ancient concrete poured into moulds, rather than quarried and dragged. This idea shows up because it sounds like a clever shortcut, and because it fits the modern love of secret techniques. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's debated in popular circles, and if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes another way of asking how the blocks look so well fitted in places. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The evidence for widespread casting instead of quarrying is not strong enough to replace the mainstream view, and archaeology suggests quarrying and stone working are well attested in Egypt. But a cautious explanation could be that some limited use of mortar and fillers and careful dressing of stones can create the appearance of seamless fit. That might support the idea that skill not casting accounts for much of the precision. And if there were experiments or minor exceptions, historians still argue whether they mattered at scale. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that builders used more than one technique for different situations without the entire pyramid being poured like a giant cake. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You return to the quarry image. You see cut lines in the rock. You see piles of debris. You see teams hauling away what's useful, leaving behind what isn't. Archaeology suggests that quarry work leaves behind distinctive traces, and the evidence we do have points to extraction happening in ways consistent with known ancient methods. Most historians agree that if you can explain the bulk of the stone supply with local quarrying and river transport, you don't need a more exotic explanation. Not because exotic explanations are forbidden, but because history tends to prefer the simplest system that fits the evidence. And yet the mystery isn't fully gone, because there are still open questions that keep your mind gently engaged, like how exactly the builders coordinated the flow of materials so the site never ran short, like how they managed seasonal labour, like how they handled mistakes. Because mistakes happen, they always do. No matter how sacred the project is, somebody drops something, somebody mismeasures something, somebody swears quietly in a way that is probably not carved on any surviving tablet. Historians still argue whether there were strict standardized block sizes or more flexible adaptive sizing depending on where stones were placed. One interpretation is that the pyramid is a mix of careful planning and on-the-spot decision-making, with some stones shaped precisely and others made to fit within a broader design. That kind of flexible precision is deeply human, and if you've ever assembled furniture without reading the instructions, you already understand it. You improvise, you adjust, you pretend it was always the plan. What if the puzzle is just patience plus muscle? Not glamorous, not mysterious, just a steady human engine powered by food, water, and a belief system strong enough to keep everyone aligned. The evidence we do have points to that kind of reality more than to any sudden outside intervention. Most historians agree that you can build a lot with simple tools if you have organisation and time. Archaeology suggests the Egyptians had both. So you let the quarry dust settle in your mind. You let the river carry your thoughts downstream. You feel the slow, inevitable movement of heavy things being moved by many hands. And you keep one small image as a motif, something you can return to when your thoughts wander. A wooden sledge, a rope, a thin sheen of water or wet sand on the path to reduce friction, the sound of breath, the sound of stone sliding just a little. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clue that glows softly at the end of this section is that stone supply and transport, while astonishing in scale, can sit comfortably within what we know of ancient Egyptian capabilities, even as the gaps invite careful, sleepy wonder. You let the image of the quarry fade, and you keep the feeling of effort, that slow, steady grind, as if the whole plateau is one long exhale. The wooden sledge in your mind becomes a kind of recurring object, the way a good bedtime story keeps one familiar thing nearby so you don't feel lost. Tonight it's the sledge, the rope, the sand underfoot, and the quiet math of angles. Because now you're standing at the base again, staring up, and the question changes shape. Even if you can supply the stones, even if you can move them across sand, you still have to lift them up, higher, again and again. This is where people's eyebrows usually launch themselves into orbit. Most historians agree that ancient builders likely used a combination of ramps, levers, and human coordination to raise blocks as the pyramid grew. Archaeology suggests ramps were used in ancient construction elsewhere, and the evidence we do have points to ramp-like features and practical ways to move heavy loads upward without needing modern cranes. What's broadly accepted is not one single ramp blueprint carved into stone, but the general idea that ramps and simple machines are enough given time and labour. And yet, historians still argue whether the main ramp approach was straight zigzag spiralling or a shifting mix that changed at different heights. That debate is one reason the pyramid keeps its aura. You can explain the principles, but the exact choreography might never be fully pinned down. You picture the work site in daylight now, because ramps feel like a sunlit problem. The sand is bright. The air is full of dust that settles on skin and makes everyone look like a statue of themselves. A ramp rises toward the pyramid like a long sloping road. Workers pull in teams. A foreman calls out counts. A scribe notes deliveries. Someone sprinkles water on the sand to reduce friction. And suddenly the sled glides just a bit more easily, which feels like a small miracle, even though it's basic physics. If you've ever pushed a heavy couch across carpet and then discovered it moves better on a blanket, you understand the emotional impact of friction reduction. One interpretation is that much of what feels impossible is really just unfamiliar work at an unfamiliar scale. We live in an era where machines hide effort. Ancient monuments make effort visible, and that visibility shocks us. A more cautious explanation could be that people underestimate what humans can do when organised, motivated and trained, especially over decades. And what if the so-called secret is annoyingly practical? The kind of secret you can summarise as do the same thing every day until it works. Most historians agree that levers were likely used to adjust and position blocks at close range. Archaeology suggests lever use across ancient cultures because the lever is one of those ideas that is almost too good to be invented only once. The evidence we do have points to stones being carefully set, not just dumped, which implies fine control at the placement stage. So you imagine crews using wooden levers, small shifts, tiny lifts, nudges, measured in inches, not feet. A block moves, settles, and the whole team pauses for a breath. Now the ramp debate is where your mind might start pulling up modern diagrams you've seen online. Some show a massive straight ramp that would require more material than the pyramid itself. Others show a spiral ramp wrapping around the sides. Some suggest zigzag ramps along one face. Historians still argue whether any single model explains all stages because each model solves some problems and creates others. A straight ramp is simple but huge. A spiral ramp is compact but can get tricky at corners. A zigzag is adaptable but requires careful turning. Let me rephrase that more carefully because it's easy to fall into the trap of wanting one perfect answer. It's possible that builders use different ramp configurations at different phases. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that moving heavy blocks up an incline is a known practical method. The mist is the exact shape of the incline at every moment in the build. You take a slow imaginary walk along the base and you look at the pyramid's edges, those sharp lines against sky. If you were a builder, you'd care about keeping those lines true because the pyramid is not just tall, it's supposed to be orderly, aligned, intentional. Archaeology suggests ancient Egyptians were skilled at surveying. Most historians agree that the pyramid's orientation and geometry point to careful planning and measurement. And here's your first light joke of the section. You think about how hard it is to hang a picture frame straight in your own home. Then you think about aligning a pyramid to the cardinal directions. Your picture frame is now ashamed. You imagine a surveying team. They stand with simple instruments, sighting along lines using stars, shadows, and repeated checks. One interpretation is that what looks like mystical sky knowledge is often practical sky use. If you use the same stars as reference points night after night, you can establish direction reliably. And what if the night sky was their blueprint, not in a magical sense, but as a steady, repeatable guide when you don't have a compass app? Now the mystery portion slips in carefully labelled. A fringe idea proposes that ramps alone cannot explain the speed or precision, and that some unknown lifting method, perhaps involving hidden internal ramps or special devices, must have existed. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's interesting because it tries to solve a real problem, the problem of height. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, It encourages you to ask how builders might have reduced ramp size while still moving blocks upward. The evidence we do have points more strongly to external methods combined with local adjustments, but historians still argue whether there might have been internal pathways or temporary structures that were later removed. Archaeology suggests the interior is complex with passages and chambers, and it's possible that internal spaces played some logistical role. A careful reading might suggest that builders could create temporary features that leave faint traces that are hard to interpret after thousands of years. That's suggestive, not conclusive. You keep your tone gentle because the point is not to declare victory for any one diagram. The point is to understand the range of plausible methods and how they fit the evidence. You step onto the imagined ramp. The slope is steady. The sand underfoot is packed. You can feel the strain in the rope through your hands, a pull that tugs at your shoulders and makes your breath deeper. The sled moves with a gritty whisper. Somebody calls out a rhythm like a chant, partly to coordinate effort and partly to keep spirits from collapsing into complaint. And here's your second light joke. You realise the chant is basically ancient cardio class. Pull and breathe. Pull and breathe. If somebody starts saying, feel the burn you're leaving. Most historians agree that large teams can move surprisingly heavy loads using sledges, rollers and lubrication. Archaeology suggests that wetting sand can reduce friction and improve hauling efficiency, which is a very satisfying detail because it is simple and clever. The evidence we do have points to people understanding their environment and manipulating it not with advanced machines, but with observation and practice. That's mainstream ground that feels like common sense, and common sense is often the most soothing thing to rest on. Historians still argue whether the workers hauled stones year-round or in seasonal bursts tied to agricultural cycles. One interpretation is that labour could surge when farming demands were lower, giving the state a large workforce for a period without starving fields of labour. A more cautious explanation could be that the workforce included a core of specialists present consistently with additional labour rotating in. That kind of mixed system would make a lot of sense for a long project. It also makes the pyramid feel less like one continuous push and more like a long series of coordinated waves. Now you reach a moment where your mind tries to leap to the top and imagine the final stones being placed. The height is dizzying. The wind is stronger. You can see the green ribbon of the Nile in the distance. A block is manoeuvred into place and the crew pauses, not to celebrate wildly, but to breathe, because you can't throw a party when you still have work tomorrow. And what if the secret is annoyingly practical, the kind of answer that disappoints people who want a single hidden trick? The evidence we do have points toward human systems, not supernatural shortcuts. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the plausibility of ramps, sledges, levers, and coordinated labour. The interpretation is how those methods changed over time and what mix worked best. The gentle imagination is you feeling the rope in your hands, hearing the chant, and sensing the pyramid rising one careful placement at a time. A popular rumour claims that the pyramids were built using sound vibration or some lost harmonic technique that levitated stone. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It's a charming idea because it feels poetic, but a cautious explanation could be that sound and rhythm mattered for coordination, not levitation. In other words, the chant lifts morale, not limestone. You let that rumour drift away like dust in sunlight, and you return to the steady sledge, the steady ramp, the steady breath. You're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clue you carry forward is that ancient engineering might look like mystery only because it is patient, repetitive, and deeply physical. The pyramid grows not from one breakthrough, but from 1,000 small correct decisions made day after day. You keep the feeling of the ramp in your legs, that long incline, that turns breathing into a kind of metronome. But now, instead of looking upward, you let your gaze travel outward away from the stone mountain and toward the places where people would have slept, eaten, argued, laughed, and tried to shake sand out of their hair. Because even if you accept ramps and sledges, the pyramid still needs something more basic than engineering. It needs a working society, a daily routine, a way to keep thousands of bodies from becoming thousands of problems. Most historians agree that large-scale labour at Giza would have required housing, food supply, water, and administration on a level that feels almost like a city. Archaeology suggests there were worker settlements and support areas near the plateau with signs of organised life rather than a chaotic scattering of temporary camps. The evidence we do have points to planned spaces, storage, production, and the kind of logistics that turns construction into a sustainable routine. You picture it at dawn, the air is cool, smoke rises from cooking fires. Someone is already awake because someone is always already awake, and that person is always slightly annoyed about it. You smell bread, and you smell something like beer, because in many ancient societies, fermented drink is not just a party item, it's a practical way to consume calories and safer hydration than questionable water sources. One interpretation is that food is the real foundation stone of the pyramid. Without steady rations, the whole system collapses. And what if the most important building material is not limestone, but grain? Most historians agree that the workforce likely included a mix of skilled labourers, craftsmen, and larger groups doing heavy hauling and support tasks. Archaeology suggests specialisation with people assigned to different roles, and the evidence we do have points to an organised community where work is divided and managed. That's mainstream ground, and it helps your brain settle. When you imagine the pyramid as the output of a well-fed, well-managed workforce, it becomes impressive in a human way, not a supernatural way. But your mind is still allowed to wonder about the social story. Were these workers forced? Were they paid? Were they proud? Were they miserable? The honest answer is that historians still argue whether the best label is something like paid labour, corvée labour, or a blend, because ancient labour systems don't map neatly onto modern categories. One interpretation is that participation could be a form of state service tied to obligations, benefits, and status. with skilled workers earning rations and respect, while others rotate in under pressure. A more cautious explanation could be that different roles experience the system differently. A stone carver with specialised training might have pride and security. A seasonal hauler might have sore shoulders and mixed feelings. You walk through the imagined workers' town. The ground is packed. There are rows of simple buildings, storage rooms, work areas. You hear the clatter of pottery, the scrape of tools being sharpened, the dull thud of bread dough being slapped into shape. Someone is repairing a sandal because sandals are apparently the weak link in every grand human plan. Here's your first light joke. You think, yes, we built the pyramids, but we still couldn't invent a shoe that doesn't fall apart in 2 weeks. History is humbling like that. Archaeology suggests that the diet at such a site could include bread, beer, and other foods that provide energy, and that there were systems for distribution. The evidence we do have points to scale, and scale implies planning. Most historians agree that you don't keep a massive workforce functioning on vibes alone. You need rations, you need schedules, you need somebody whose whole job is counting, and that person probably becomes the most powerful non-king in the region, because whoever controls bread controls moods. One interpretation is that the pyramid project also creates community identity. People might see themselves as part of a royal undertaking, participating in an act that links their lives to cosmic order and national pride. And what if, at night after the day's work, some workers sit outside, share food, and look up at the growing pyramid silhouette against the stars, feeling a strange mixture of exhaustion and belonging? At the same time, you keep your balance. The pyramid is a state project. State projects can be inspiring and oppressive, sometimes at once. A careful reading might suggest that even if many workers were not enslaved in the sensational sense, the system could still be coercive because refusing state service might not be an option. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it's a reasonable way to keep the story honest without turning it into a melodrama. Historians still argue whether later stories of brutal conditions reflect reality at Giza or reflect later moral storytelling about powerful kings. There's no full consensus, and you don't need one tonight. You just need a calm understanding that ancient labour can't be reduced to a single emotional label. Now you let a small mystery thread slip in carefully framed. A popular rumour claims that no human workforce could have managed such a feat without secret knowledge passed down from a lost civilization. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's often fueled by the idea that ancient people could not coordinate large numbers effectively. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a question about administration, not aliens. Could a Bronze Age style state manage a mega project? The evidence we do have points to yes, at least in broad strokes, because Egypt shows signs of centralised organisation, resource control, and record keeping. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The rumour tends to rely more on modern disbelief than on specific ancient evidence. A more cautious explanation could be that people underestimate what coordinated human labour can do when supported by agriculture hierarchy and time. What's broadly accepted is that ancient societies built enormous things, and that building enormous things is often the point of having a state. You step into a quieter corner of the imagined settlement, a small room, a bench, a simple clay jar. You hear the scratch of a reed pen on a surface. A scribe records distributions, deliveries, assignments. Most historians agree that writing and administration are central to the Egyptian state. Archaeology suggests bureaucratic systems existed, and the evidence we do have points to record keeping that would make large projects feasible. Not glamorous, but powerful. Here's your second light joke. You imagine the scribe writing today delivered stone bread, beer more stone, and a complaint about the bread, and tomorrow delivered the same. Ancient life, repetitive but at least consistent. Now you follow a group of workers toward the plateau. Their footsteps are steady, their shoulders carry ropes, their hands carry tools. Some are skilled specialists and some are there to haul. One interpretation is that this mixture of roles creates a kind of layered workforce where knowledge passes from experienced hands to newer ones. And what if the pyramid is not just a tomb but a training system? A place where techniques are refined and shared, where the state's ability to build becomes stronger each season. Historians still argue whether the workforce lived there year-round or in rotations because the size and organisation could shift. A more cautious explanation could be that a core community stays and maintains continuity while others rotate in. That would allow farming communities to keep functioning while also contributing to the royal project. It also makes the site feel like a living organism, expanding and contracting with the seasons. You pause and listen to the ambient sounds. Tools clink, voices murmur, wind brushes over stone. In your mind you keep the sledge as a motif, but now you add something else. The smell of bread at dawn. It's warm, simple and grounding. It reminds you that even the biggest mysteries are built from everyday needs. A fringe idea proposes that the workers' town evidence is exaggerated or misinterpreted, and that the real builders were outsiders who left no trace. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A careful reading might suggest that while interpretations of specific features can vary, the broader picture of an organised workforce supported by nearby infrastructure fits what we know of large ancient projects. The evidence we do have points toward local organisation rather than a vanished foreign crew operating in silence. And what if the builders went home nightly under stars? Not all of them. Not always, but enough that the pyramid is tied into ordinary lives. Someone finishes a shift, returns to a small room, eats, laughs softly, falls asleep. They dream. The next day they return. The pyramid grows. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that organised worker life around Giza is plausible and supported by archaeological patterns. The interpretation is the social texture, pride mixed with pressure, skill mixed with strain. The gentle imagination is the dawn bread, the murmured jokes, the stars above the half-built monument. You're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues, and the clue you carry forward is that the question of who built the pyramids is also a question of who lived near them, who ate to fuel them, who slept to endure them, and who kept showing up day after day until stone became a horizon. You leave the smell of dawn bread hanging in the air like a warm memory, and you follow the workers back into the brighter, harsher reality of stone. The pyramid doesn't care about your feelings. It just sits there, enormous, patiently, forcing you to ask practical questions until your brain gives up and becomes sleepy. Tonight's practical question is simple and stubborn. What could they cut stone with, shape stone with, and measure stone with when their toolkit looks so small compared to ours? Most historians agree that ancient Egyptians used a mix of copper tools, stone, pounders, wooden levers, and abrasive sands to work stone, especially limestone. Archaeology suggests tool marks and workshop remains fit these kinds of methods, and the evidence we do have points to a skilled craft tradition that can achieve impressive results with modest materials. That's the mainstream anchor, and it's helpful because it shifts the question from what machine did they use to what technique did they master. You step into a stone working area in your imagination. The air smells like dust and sweat. The sunlight is white and sharp. There's a steady percussion, sound, rock against rock like a slow drum beat that never ends. A worker holds a dolerite pounder, a hard stone tool, and strikes limestone again and again. Chips fly. Another worker uses copper chisels for finer shaping. Someone else uses sand as an abrasive grinding surfaces, smooth with patient repetition. One interpretation is that ancient craft is often less about cutting through material like a knife and more about persuading material to change shape through repeated intelligent effort. And what if the real secret is not stronger tools but stronger patience? Historians still argue whether the most challenging stone elements, like granite in certain internal spaces, required different workflows or more specialised teams, because granite is a tougher, more stubborn rock than limestone. The evidence we do have points to granite being used in some key places, and archaeology suggests that pounding and abrasion could work, but at a cost in time and labour. A more cautious explanation could be that Egyptians reserved the hardest stones for specific structural or symbolic purposes and leaned on limestone for the bulk. That would be both practical and culturally meaningful. You run your fingers along a mental tool mark. It feels rough. It feels real. Most historians agree that tool marks are one of those quiet, unglamorous clues that matter a lot. Archaeology suggests you can compare marks' methods and known ancient tools to see what's plausible. The evidence we do have points to human hands making human marks, not a clean modern machine cut. Now, because your brain is a modern brain, it immediately tries to challenge this. Copper is soft. How does soft copper shape hard stone? This is where technique matters. Copper chisels can work well on limestone, and for harder stones, pounding and abrasive techniques can do more of the heavy lifting. Sand, especially quartz-rich sand, becomes like a silent saw blade when used with the right motion. One interpretation is that the Egyptians were less limited by the softness of copper than we assume because they used the whole tool system, not just the metal. A careful reading might suggest that when you see a finished surface, you're seeing the final stage after many layers of work. Here's your first light joke. You imagine an ancient stoneworker watching a modern person walk up and say, "Copper is too soft, impossible." And the stoneworker just stares, covered in dust, holding a tool that clearly works, and thinks, "I don't know what to tell you, friend. I'm literally doing it." Ancient sarcasm is probably not carved on a wall, but it definitely existed. Now historians still argue whether certain precision features in the pyramid complex were achieved primarily through meticulous measuring during placement or through later dressing and smoothing. The evidence we do have points to both processes existing in Egyptian building, and archaeology suggests different stages could be used for different areas. A more cautious explanation could be that builders were willing to be rough where rough would be hidden, and precise where precision would be seen or felt. That would mean the pyramid is not uniformly perfect, but selectively perfected, which is exactly how humans tend to work when they are managing effort. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible the most impressive precision is concentrated in key parts, not everywhere. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now the mist. This is where the internet loves to arrive in a cape. A popular rumour claims that the pyramids show machining so advanced it cannot be explained by ancient tools. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often focuses on cherry-picked examples without considering the full range of evidence. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And usually the evidence for truly impossible machining is thin because many impressive surfaces can be produced by abrasion, repeated fitting, and careful measurement, especially over long time spans with lots of skilled labour. That said, the mystery isn't completely imaginary. The mystery is in the details we can't fully reconstruct. Historians still argue whether the exact methods for some stone working tasks are known in every step, because written technical manuals are rare. We have artifacts, we have marks, we have reasonable reconstructions, but the full choreography can be hard to confirm. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You move from tools to measuring because the pyramid is not just big, it's shaped. You imagine a surveyor with plumb lines measuring rods and sight lines. Most historians agree that Egyptian surveyors were capable and systematic. Archaeology suggests they used simple but effective devices, and the evidence we do have points to consistent geometry and alignment across major projects. One interpretation is that precise work does not require high tech, it requires consistent reference points and disciplined repetition. What if your whole life is built around watching the Nile rise and fall, tracking seasons, watching stars and counting grain? Your mind becomes a measuring instrument. Here's your second light joke. You realise that in ancient Egypt the person most likely to be powerful is the person who can measure accurately. In modern life, that person is also powerful, but we call them an engineer, and they still can't measure the distance to the next coffee shop without opening an app. Progress. You wander closer to an internal passage in your imagination, feeling the temperature drop slightly. Granite blocks are heavier, darker, more stubborn. The surfaces are smoother. The joints feel tighter. Most historians agree that internal architecture shows careful planning and skilled workmanship. Archaeology suggests these spaces were built intentionally, not accidentally. The evidence we do have points to a design that is both functional and symbolic. One interpretation is that the harder stone, the careful fit, and the controlled pathways reflect a desire to protect and sanctify key spaces. And what if the real goal is not to impress future tourists, but to ensure a king's eternal stability in a world where eternity is the biggest project anyone can imagine? Now for your 30% mystery, you allow a fringe idea to float past without letting it anchor. A fringe idea proposes that the Egyptians inherited stoneworking knowledge from an older tradition, perhaps through cultural contact or a lost teaching lineage. This theory isn't widely accepted as a sweeping explanation, but the general idea that knowledge travels is perfectly reasonable. A careful reading might suggest that Egypt did not develop in isolation, and that trade and contact could bring ideas. A more cautious explanation could be that while influences might exist, the core development of Egyptian monumental building shows strong local continuity. The evidence we do have points to Egyptians adapting and refining techniques within their own culture over time. Historians still argue whether some specific tool marks or surface features are best explained by one technique or another, because interpretation of marks can be tricky. This is suggestive, not conclusive, and it's the kind of debate that keeps archaeology honest. Nobody gets to declare the final answer and go home early. So you stand again at the edge between solid ground and mist. Solid ground is that stone working with copper, stone pounders, abrasives and smart measurement is plausible and supported by multiple lines of evidence. Mist is that we cannot confirm every micro step of every process, and that uncertainty invites theories. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the toolkit and the visible marks. The interpretation is how workflows were organised and where precision mattered most. The gentle imagination is you hearing the rhythm of pounding and grinding like a slow drum and realising that the pyramid might be less a miracle and more a marathon. And if marathons make you sleepy, congratulations, you're exactly in the right place. You let the percussion of stone working fade into the background, like a drumbeat that moves farther away as you walk. In its place, you hear something softer, night air, a faint hiss of wind, and above you the sky, the same sky ancient surveyors watched with more devotion than most of us give to our phone notifications. You tilt your head back and let your eyes rest on the stars, because now the pyramid feels less like a pile of stone and more like a deliberate gesture toward the heavens. Most historians agree that the pyramids, especially at Giza, show impressive alignment to the cardinal directions. Archaeology suggests ancient Egyptians had effective surveying techniques, and the evidence we do have points to careful planning rather than accidental straightness. You can feel it in the way the edges run true, in the way the whole structure seems to sit on the land, as if it was meant to be there, not dropped there. And yet historians still argue whether the exact method used to achieve that alignment was based primarily on star observations, sun shadows, or a combination, because there are multiple plausible techniques. This is one of those debates that doesn't undermine the mainstream picture. It enriches it. It reminds you that even if the outcome is clear, the process can still be uncertain. You imagine a surveyor standing on sand with a simple tool, maybe a sighting device, maybe a plumb line, maybe nothing more than stakes and string and a practiced eye. He waits for a star to cross a certain point, or he watches the sun cast a shadow at different times, and he marks lines. One interpretation is that ritual and practicality are not separate in this world. Watching the sky is both sacred and useful. A careful reading might suggest that Egyptian religion, with its focus on order and cosmic balance, makes precise alignment not just a technical goal, but a spiritual act. And what if the night sky is their blueprint, not as a coded secret, but as a calm, repeatable reference when everything else shifts? Most historians agree that the ancient Egyptian worldview links the king and the cosmos, with monuments helping to stabilize order. Archaeology suggests that many religious and funerary structures are oriented with care. The evidence we do have points to a culture that treats direction alignment and symbolic geography as important. So you picture the pyramid as a kind of anchor, a stone statement saying the world has a centre and the king belongs to it. Now your mind does what it always does. It wants to turn that symbolic story into a precise claim. Like the pyramid is aligned to a specific constellation with a specific meaning, and therefore it must be some kind of star map. This is where you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is alignment and symbolic sky interest. The mist is the exact meaning of every alignment and how intentionally it was meant to encode details beyond general cosmic order. Historians still argue whether certain internal passage angles and orientations were meant to point to specific stars at particular times, because the evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways. Some interpretations suggest star-related symbolism. A more cautious explanation could be that alignments serve multiple purposes at once, including practical surveying constraints, structural considerations, and symbolic resonance. This might support the idea that a single feature can have more than one reason behind it, which is satisfying because it's true of human decisions in general. You buy a chair because it's comfortable, and also because it looks nice, and also because it was on sale. Ancient people are not aliens. They are complicated shoppers, just with more linen. Here's your first light joke. You imagine an ancient architect explaining alignment choices to a royal official, and the official says, "Great, does it align with the gods?" And the architect says, "Yes." And the official says, "Great, does it align with the king's ego?" And the architect says, "Also, yes." And the official nods like this is the only acceptable design brief. You walk along the plateau in your imagination and you notice how the stars seem to move when you move, as if the sky is following you. That sensation is gentle and hypnotic. It makes you understand why the sky becomes a tool. The sky is stable in its patterns, even if stars shift slowly over long time spans. The ground shifts more. The sand drifts. The river changes. But the sky night after night offers a rhythm. Most historians agree that ancient surveying could use stellar observations. And archaeology suggests that knowledge of the heavens existed in Egyptian culture. The evidence we do have points to careful observational practices, even if we don't have a surviving technical manual that spells out the exact steps. One interpretation is that skilled observers could establish north by tracking circumpolar stars, those that circle the pole and never set, using repeated observations to mark a true line. And what if in the quiet of pre-dawn, the surveyor feels like he is drawing a line between Earth and eternity? Now for your 30% mystery, you let in the kind of theories that people love, but you keep them labelled. A popular rumour claims that the pyramids are aligned not just to cardinal directions, but to cosmic cycles so precise they must involve advanced knowledge of precession or hidden astronomical codes. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence tends to be selective. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Often patterns can be found when you look hard enough, especially in a structure as prominent and measured as the Great Pyramid. A more cautious explanation could be that humans are excellent at finding meaning in geometry, and that the builders may have intended broad symbolic alignments rather than exact numerical prophecy. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible some alignments have multiple interpretations, and it's also possible we sometimes read modern obsessions into ancient design. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You step closer to the pyramid's shadow and the temperature changes. The stone radiates stored coolness now. You think about internal design, about passages that angle upward, chambers placed within the bulk, and the way the whole interior is like a controlled tunnel through a mountain. Most historians agree that the interior spaces are intentionally planned. Archaeology suggests they reflect both practical engineering choices and symbolic ideas about the king's journey. The evidence we do have points to a blend of function and meaning. Historians still argue whether the primary function of certain shafts or narrow passages was ventilation, ritual, star symbolism, or something else, because each explanation has strengths and weaknesses. One interpretation is that some features might serve practical needs during construction, and then later take on symbolic readings. A more cautious explanation could be that the same passage can be used for practical reasons first, and then framed as sacred later. Humans do this constantly. You build a hallway because you need to walk through it, and later you hang family photos and tell stories about it. Here's your second light joke. You imagine explaining that to a modern tourist. This passage could be for air or for stars or for ceremony. And the tourist says, "So which one is it?" And you say, "Yes." And the tourist looks annoyed because they wanted a single answer, and history just shrugs politely. Now you let your mind float back to the plateau at night. The stars are sharp. The pyramid's silhouette is steady. You feel the gentle sensation that the monument is both deeply earthly and deeply cosmic. It's stone-heavy, practical. It's also a symbol pointing upward. Most historians agree that Egyptian religion and royal ideology are intertwined with ideas of cosmic order. Archaeology suggests monuments express those ideas in architecture. The evidence we do have points to intentionality. And what if the alignment is less about hiding secret data and more about calming the universe? What if the builders believe that by aligning this structure correctly, they are aligning the world, keeping balance, making the next flood come, making the harvest return, making the king's afterlife stable, making the living feel safe? That's a cinematic what if, but it's also psychologically plausible because humans often build symbols to feel less vulnerable. A fringe idea proposes that the alignment indicates the pyramids were designed as a global signal, a message to distant civilizations, or a marker for future generations. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that the message was primarily meant for the gods and for Egypt itself, and that future awe is an unintended side effect. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the cardinal alignment and the cultural importance of the sky. The interpretation is the specific methods and meanings of particular features. The gentle imagination is you standing under stars, letting the pyramid feel like a silent compass. You're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clue you carry forward is that Egyptian builders likely had both practical surveying skill and a sky-filled worldview, and those two things together can create a monument that feels like it belongs to the stars, even while it is rooted in sand. You keep your eyes on the sky for a moment longer, then you let them drift back down to the stone, because wonder is nice, but the pyramid always pulls you back to its physical reality. You step toward an opening in your imagination, a passage that feels cooler than the outside air. The sound changes, outside wind and distance, inside hush like the monument is holding its breath. Now the question becomes less about hauling blocks and more about what's hidden within the mass. The pyramid is not solid, it's shaped from the inside too, with corridors, chambers and tight angles that feel intentional. Most historians agree that the Great Pyramid's internal layout includes passages and chambers that reflect planning rather than accident. Archaeology suggests the builders worked with a design that could shift as the project evolved, and the evidence we do have points to changes and adjustments during construction. This is mainstream ground that is quietly fascinating because it means the pyramid is not just a finished product, it's also a record of decision making. You walk down a sloping corridor, the air is still, the stone smells faintly mineral like cold chalk. You can almost hear your own heartbeat. You run your hand along a wall and feel that it's not perfectly smooth everywhere, because perfection is expensive and builders choose where to spend effort. One interpretation is that the pyramid's interior shows a blend of initial ambition and later correction. A careful reading might suggest that builders sometimes changed plans either because of structural concerns, logistical realities, or evolving ritual ideas. And what if the pyramid is not a single blueprint carried out flawlessly, but a conversation between human intention and stubborn stone? Historians still argue whether certain features were planned from the beginning or added later as solutions, because the evidence can be interpreted in different ways. That debate is a good reminder that ancient people were not robots following a fixed instruction manual. They responded to problems, they adjusted, they improvised. You pass a junction and you imagine workers at two different moments in time. One group is carving and clearing during construction, dusty and loud. Another group is later in ceremonial quiet, moving with caution, carrying lamps. The same space holds both stories. Most historians agree that the internal spaces, including major chambers, were designed with purpose. Archaeology suggests the use of granite in key areas indicates deliberate structural and symbolic choices. The evidence we do have points to careful placement of heavy stones, such as massive beams that relieve weight and create stable voids. This matters because it shows engineering logic, not just ritual decoration. Now you let your mind linger on a detail that often sparks modern fascination: the joints. In some places, stones seem to meet with impressive tightness, with little gap. People look at that and feel the itch of suspicion. How did they do that without modern measuring tools? But a more cautious explanation could be that when you have skilled craftsmen, time, and a need for stability, you can achieve tight fits through repeated checking and dressing. It's slow work, and slow work is the kind of work history is made of. Here's your first light joke. You think about how you can't even get two lids to match two identical plastic containers in your kitchen, and yet ancient builders can fit stone to stone. You decide the real ancient miracle is not pyramids, it's organization. Again, you continue deeper and the corridor feels like it narrows, not just in space but in mood. Your breath sounds louder, the coolness is more obvious. In your imagination, a lamp flame flickers and throws orange light on grey stone, making the surfaces look alive. One interpretation is that the interior experience was meant to feel controlled, like a transition away from the everyday world. And what if the architecture itself is part of the ritual guiding you into a mindset of seriousness and cosmic order? Most historians agree that the pyramid's interior was not designed for public access. Archaeology suggests access points were controlled, and the evidence we do have points to sealing systems and protective measures. That's mainstream ground, and it fits with the idea of a royal tomb complex, a place meant to safeguard a king's afterlife equipment and body. Now historians still argue whether the pyramid functioned purely as a tomb or also carried additional symbolic roles beyond burial, because monumental architecture can serve multiple purposes at once. The tomb function is widely accepted, but the deeper symbolic function is where interpretation expands. A careful reading might suggest the pyramid is also a cosmic machine in a metaphorical sense, not generating energy but generating meaning, tying kingship to the sky. And because we promised mystery without misleading you, let a fringe tidbit drift by. A fringe idea proposes that hidden chambers or passages exist that would radically change our understanding, perhaps indicating a different primary purpose. This theory isn't widely accepted as a sweeping rewrite, but the general idea that there may be undiscovered spaces is plausible because large structures can contain voids and complexities. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a gentle invitation to humility. The pyramid is vast. It's possible not everything has been mapped in perfect detail. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Claims that the pyramid is definitely a power plant or definitely a coded archive are thin in evidence. but the possibility of unknown voids or construction features is a more cautious, reasonable kind of mystery. The evidence we do have points to known passages and chambers, and archaeology suggests that some questions remain open about the internal complexity. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible there are features we haven't fully interpreted yet, but that doesn't automatically mean they imply a non-Egyptian origin or a non-funerary purpose. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You stop at a space in your imagination that feels like a chamber where the ceiling rises and the sound changes. The stone is darker here, granite perhaps, and the joints feel more deliberate. You think about the weight above you, the millions of tons of stone pressing down, and yet this void stays open. Most historians agree that this indicates intentional engineering. Archaeology suggests builders understood load distribution and used relieving structures to manage stress. The evidence we do have points to practical intelligence at work. One interpretation is that internal planning reflects both engineering constraints and ritual priorities. You want the chamber stable. You want it located where it makes sense structurally. You also want it meaningful, oriented, protected and sealed. The pyramid becomes a compromise between physics and belief. And what if the real story is not a battle between mainstream history and wild mystery, but a collaboration between human imagination and human practicality? Historians still argue whether the so-called changes in plan reflect political shifts, religious shifts, or purely technical problem solving. There's no full consensus because the pyramid does not come with a diary. It comes with stone clues. Here's your second light joke. You imagine the builders leaving a note that says, "We changed the plan because somebody messed up." And then you imagine that note being lost, and modern people arguing for centuries about cosmic symbolism. Sometimes history is just one missing sticky note away from peace. Now you let your mind float out of the interior again, back toward the entrance back into the night air. As you step out, the stars feel brighter after the darkness. The pyramid's exterior feels different now that you've walked through its inner hush. It feels less like a solid mountain and more like a designed object, a structure with hidden decisions inside it. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the existence of planned passages and chambers, and the engineering logic implied by them. The interpretation is what each feature meant and why plans might have shifted. The gentle imagination is your lamplight flickering on stone, your hand brushing a joint, your awareness of the weight above. You're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues, and the clue you carry forward is that the pyramid's interior supports the idea of careful Egyptian planning and engineering, while leaving just enough uncertainty about details to keep your curiosity warm, like a small coal in the night. You step back into the open air in your imagination, and the night feels soft against your face after the cool interior. The pyramid stands there like it knows you've been snooping inside and doesn't care. The stars hang above, indifferent, and the wind skims the sand with a quiet hiss that sounds almost like whispering. Now your mind goes looking for something very specific because you're human, and humans love labels. You want names? Not just the king's name, but the names of the people who actually move the stones. You want a signature, a mark, a little human stamp that says, yes, we were here and we did this. Most historians agree that there are markings, graffiti and quarry style notes associated with pyramid building that can connect work, crews and administrative organisation to royal projects. Archaeology suggests these kinds of marks were functional, used to track crews' deliveries or placement, and the evidence we do have points to human teams working under a system. This is mainstream ground, and it's one of the most emotionally satisfying kinds of evidence, because it feels like hearing a voice through time. You picture a block in a storage yard. It's rough, not yet dressed. On it there's a painted mark, maybe in red, maybe in black. It could be a crew name, a shift designation, a location note. In your imagination, the mark is casual, quick, meant for co-workers, not tourists. One interpretation is that these marks show the pyramid is not a mysterious monolith built by faceless labour, but a project handled by distinct groups with identities. And what if the most important inscription is not a formal royal text, but a messy note that survived by accident? Historians still argue whether we should interpret certain markings as strictly practical labels or as more playful crew identities, because humans can't resist making work a little social. There's no full consensus on how much personality to read into a label, but the existence of labels itself supports the idea of organised crews. Now the king's name comes into the picture again, because a lot of marks relate to administration. Most historians agree that Khufu's reign is closely associated with the Great Pyramid. Archaeology suggests that when royal names appear in contexts tied to construction, they can be meaningful indicators of association. The evidence we do have points to a connection between the royal project and the workforce system. But because we're keeping language safe, you don't let your brain turn that into an absolute one-line proof of everything. It's suggestive, not conclusive, to treat any single mark as the final mic drop. A careful reading might suggest that marks need context preservation history and comparison with other evidence. And this is where you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Solid ground marks exist and they fit with organised construction. Mist, how much each specific mark can prove by itself and how confidently we can interpret every faded stroke. Let me rephrase that more carefully. A mark might support the idea that a crew worked under a royal project, but it does not single-handedly answer every question about method, timeline, or labour conditions. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now your mind gently shifts to the idea of worker gangs, because ancient Egypt is known for organising labour into named groups. One interpretation is that naming a crew creates cohesion, pride and accountability. It's easier to motivate a team with an identity than a pile of anonymous backs. And what if in the shade at noon, a group jokes about their crew name the way modern people joke about team names at a company retreat, except with fewer PowerPoint slides and more sand? Here's your first light joke. You imagine an ancient foreman saying, "All right, team eternal glory, you're late again." And someone in the back mutters, "Maybe eternal glory should come with a longer lunch break. Ancient workplace comedy writes itself. Most historians agree that we do not have the names and biographies of most individual workers. Archaeology suggests the workforce was large and varied, and the evidence we do have points more to systems than to individuals. That's one of the reasons mystery theories thrive. When the human details are missing, the mind fills the gap with dramatic answers. But you hold that gently. You don't need dramatic, you need plausible. Historians still argue whether the limited survival of individual worker names reflects social hierarchy, preservation bias, or simply the fact that everyday records are less likely to survive. One interpretation is that the pyramid, like many monuments, preserves the names of the powerful more easily than the names of the ordinary. A more cautious explanation could be that the ordinary were always there, but their voices were written on materials that didn't last. Now, because we promised a quirky tidbit each section, you let one drift in, carefully framed. A popular rumour claims that secret inscriptions exist that reveal a non-Egyptian origin hidden in inaccessible chambers or coded into symbols. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The rumour often relies on the idea that if we haven't seen everything, the unseen part must contain a shocking truth. A more cautious explanation could be that hidden areas, if they exist, would likely contain construction features or ritual elements consistent with the broader context, rather than a sudden declaration that someone else built everything. Still, you treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, because it helps you practice good historical thinking. What would count as convincing? Not a vague story, not a blurry photo, not a trust me. You would want consistent, verifiable context with supporting patterns. And you remind yourself again, we're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. You walk along the base in your imagination and you run your hand over stone. You think about how marks could be applied in different stages. A block is quarried and labelled. It's moved and labelled again. It's placed and covered, and the mark disappears inside the structure. One interpretation is that the pyramid might contain countless little human notes hidden within it, not as secret messages, but as the ordinary bookkeeping of a vast project. And what if the pyramid is full of invisible handwriting, like a library where the pages are sealed inside stone? Most historians agree that much of the pyramid's construction process is inferred from physical evidence, rather than described in detailed texts. Archaeology suggests that physical traces, including marks, tool patterns, and site layout, can tell a coherent story. The evidence we do have points to Egyptian planning and labour systems, even if we can't read every sentence of their working life. Historians still argue whether particular marks should be weighted more heavily than architectural and contextual evidence, because different scholars prioritise different kinds of clues. A careful reading might suggest that the best approach is layered. You don't rely on one thing, you combine. You look for consistency across multiple kinds of evidence. That is suggestive, not conclusive, but it's how careful historical reasoning stays honest. Here's your second light joke. You imagine a modern debate panel where everyone is arguing passionately about a faded mark on stone. And in the back, a worker from 4,500 years ago is like it says, "Move this block to the left. Please calm down." It's a joke, of course, but it's also a reminder that the most important messages are often the least dramatic. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that marks and labels exist and fit with organised crews. The interpretation is how we read them and how much personality they contain. The gentle imagination is you picturing hidden handwriting inside the pyramid, the quiet administrative life sealed into stone. You let the wind brush your face. You feel the sledge motif return, not as an object now, but as a feeling of labour being tracked, counted and remembered only partially. And you carry forward a clue that is both solid and soft. The pyramid is not anonymous. It holds hints of human organisation, but it also keeps many names private, which leaves space for wonder without requiring a replacement story. You let the wind keep whispering across the stone, and you let your attention drift away from marks and labels towards something much softer and much riskier, the stories people tell after they leave. Because the pyramids do not only live in limestone, they live in memory, and memory is famous for taking a simple fact, putting it in its pocket, and washing it 3 times until it comes out as a legend. Most historians agree that later visitors to Egypt, especially in the Greek and Roman worlds, wrote accounts that mix what they saw with what they were told. Archaeology suggests that by the time many of these travellers arrive, the pyramids are already ancient to Egyptians themselves, and the evidence we do have points to a long gap between construction and many famous written descriptions. That gap matters because it creates space for story drift, the gentle sliding of details as they pass from mouth to mouth. You imagine yourself not as a modern listener now, but as a traveller in sandals that are not as comfortable as you were promised. You arrive with dust on your calves and curiosity in your chest. You see the pyramids rise on the horizon like a row of quiet mountains. You ask someone local because that is what travellers do. You ask a guide, a priest, an official, a man selling water, and everybody gives you an answer that fits their own world. One interpretation is that these later stories are not simply wrong, but shaped by what the teller thinks you want to hear, shaped by what makes sense in their culture, shaped by politics pride, and the fact that a good story gets repeated more than a careful footnote. And what if the loudest tale is the least reliable, not because it is malicious, but because it is entertaining? Most historians agree that one of the most famous names connected to pyramid storytelling is Heroditus, who writes about Egypt centuries after the pyramids are built. The evidence we do have points to him collecting reports, observations, and local traditions. Archaeology suggests some of his descriptions align loosely with realities of Egyptian life, while others feel exaggerated or confused. That blend is exactly what you would expect from a traveller writing for an audience far away who wants wonder on the page. Historians still argue whether Heroditus and other later writers preserve valuable echoes of older traditions, or mostly reflect storytelling shaped by distance and time. You let that debate line hang in the air like a lantern, because it is not an insult to the past to say memory shifts. It is a basic feature of human life. If you have ever heard a family story about an event you personally witnessed and thought, wow, that is not what happened at all, you already understand ancient history in your bones. Here is your first light joke. You imagine a Greek traveller returning home and telling friends, "You would not believe this place. They have a pyramid so big it could block out the sun," and everyone nods like that sounds accurate, because no one has Google to fact check, and also because everyone loves a good exaggeration at dinner. Now you keep your footing on mainstream ground. Most historians agree that later accounts can be useful, but they must be handled carefully and compared with material evidence. Archaeology suggests that the physical remains at Giza, the quarry, traces the site layout and the broader pattern of Egyptian monument building provide a steadier foundation than any single narrative written centuries later. The evidence we do have points to a world where the pyramids are part of an Egyptian tradition, even if later writers misunderstand or dramatize details. One interpretation is that when later writers describe labour as purely brutal or purely sensational, they may be leaning into moral storytelling about kings and power rather than reporting a balanced social reality. A more cautious explanation could be that big state projects can be harsh, but that later storytelling often turns complex labour systems into simpler, more dramatic pictures. That is a possibility, not a certainty, and you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You walk slowly along the imaginary path a traveller would take. You see the pyramids, you see the temples, you see smaller structures that later eyes might miss because they are not as photogenic. The guide points and talks, and you realise something important. The guide is also storyteller. He is paid in coin or in favour to keep you engaged. If he says, "I do not know," that is a terrible business model. So he fills gaps with confidence, and confidence is contagious. Here's your second light joke. You picture an ancient guide saying, "This is exactly how it was built, totally sure," and you nod politely while thinking, "Sir, you are guessing with impressive swagger. Ancient customer service is timeless." Now, because we promised mystery theory without misleading you, let the mist drift in with a clearly labelled tag. A popular rumour claims that ancient writers deliberately hid the truth about pyramid origins, replacing it with false stories to protect secrets. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that confusion and distortion happen naturally when people repeat stories across centuries and across languages, especially when the original builders left limited explanatory texts meant for outsiders. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it helps you ask a useful question. Why do people love hidden truth stories? One interpretation is that hidden truth stories feel satisfying because they offer a single key that opens everything. But the pyramids resist single keys. They are too big, too old, and too layered. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And story drift is one of the main reasons that uncertainty stays alive. You turn your attention to how myths form. A careful reading might suggest that myths grow where records thin, and especially where monuments are too large to feel human. When a structure feels beyond normal life, the mind reaches for explanations beyond normal life. That does not mean the explanations are true. It means the structure triggers a certain kind of imagination. Most historians agree that Egypt itself, over its long history, reshaped the meaning of older monuments, sometimes restoring them, sometimes reusing them, sometimes weaving them into new religious and political stories. Archaeology suggests that sites can have multiple lives. The evidence we do have points to the pyramids being old even to later Egyptians, and that alone can create layers of interpretation. A later priest might explain the pyramids in a way that fits later theology. A later official might explain them in a way that flatters later power. A later visitor might explain them in a way that sells scrolls back home. Here is your third light joke. You imagine a scribe in a foreign city copying a traveller's tale and thinking, I have no idea if this is accurate, but it's going to be a bestseller, so I will keep writing. Ancient monetization apparently is just as unstoppable as modern monetization. Now you return to the guiding question, not as a shouting match, but as a calm sorting exercise. Did Egyptians build the pyramids? The evidence we do have points strongly toward Egyptian planning, Egyptian labour systems, and Egyptian cultural purpose. That is mainstream ground. Later stories do not erase it, but later stories can blur the edges. They can turn practical ramps into dramatic miracles. They can turn administrators into villains. They can turn labour into a single mood. They can shift timelines. They can pull focus away from the steady accumulation of work and toward a single shocking explanation. One interpretation is that the loudest stories survive not because they are the most accurate, but because they are easiest to repeat. And what if the story is pointing at something else? Not a secret builder, but a secret habit in the human mind. The habit of turning effort into mystery when the effort is too big to picture. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that traveller accounts exist and are shaped by time and audience. The interpretation is how much weight we give each account and why certain motifs repeat. The gentle imagination is you walking beside a tired traveller at dusk, listening to him choose the most dramatic version of the story because it will keep his listeners awake. Which is funny because you are doing the opposite. You are choosing the calm version so your listeners can drift off. You let the traveller's voice fade into the desert air like a campfire tale that ends with a shrug. The pyramids remain unmoved by stories, but your mind keeps turning the question over like a smooth stone in your palm. Because once you admit that stories drift, you also have to admit something else. Modern disbelief is powerful. It can be so powerful that it becomes its own kind of mythology, a story we tell ourselves about what humans can and cannot do. Most historians agree that no advanced machines are required to explain pyramid construction in broad terms, given known ancient techniques and sufficient labour and time. Archaeology suggests practical methods for quarrying, hauling and placement, and the evidence we do have points to a system that is extraordinary in scale, but not necessarily extraordinary in physics. that is mainstream ground, and it has a calming quality like standing on firm rock. And yet, historians still argue whether we have reconstructed the most efficient version of the process or merely a plausible one, because there are many ways to solve a construction problem. That debate keeps the door cracked open. Not open to anything goes, but open to multiple interpretations of the exact workflow. Now you step into the modern world for a moment, because modern world is where the next layer of mystery is born. You imagine a person looking at a close-up photo of stone joints or a diagram of alignment and saying that's impossible, therefore something hidden must be true. One interpretation is that the word impossible often means unfamiliar, not actually impossible. A more cautious explanation could be that we underestimate ancient skill because we measure them against our daily life, not against what a trained specialist can do with decades of practice and a state behind them. And what if the biggest mystery is our own bias, the quiet assumption that ancient equals primitive? Here is your first light joke. You think about how people will say ancient people couldn't do that while also admitting they don't know how to cook rice without a timer. Human confidence is a fascinating artifact. Now, because this section promises the part of the story where rumours thrive, you let them in, gently labelled and handled like fragile glass. A popular rumour claims that the pyramids were built with lost technology, either a vanished machine method or some advanced knowledge that disappeared. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it tends to lean on astonishment rather than on direct evidence. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The evidence for a missing high-tech toolkit is thin. We do not see clear traces of materials or devices that would be hard to hide completely, but we do see something else that is easy to overlook. We see the kind of quiet technology that does not look like technology to modern eyes. Coordination, standardized procedures, repeated measurement, abrasion and friction control, supply systems. That is the technology of organization. Most historians agree that ancient states can generate impressive outputs through administration and social structure. Archaeology suggests Egypt had those structures, and the evidence we do have points to a society capable of mobilizing resources. One interpretation is that the real engine of the pyramid is bureaucracy, which is not romantic but is deeply effective. And what if the lost technology is not a machine but a social skill, a willingness to coordinate huge projects for reasons that feel meaningful enough to justify the effort? Historians still argue whether modern reconstructions sometimes underestimate how much trial and error ancient builders use because a finished monument hides the failed experiments. A more cautious explanation could be that there were mistakes, adjustments, and improvements that left subtle traces. But because failure is less likely to be preserved or celebrated, we mostly see the successes. That selective survival makes the past look smoother than it was. Now another rumour arrives, a little flashier. A fringe idea proposes that the pyramids were not built but inherited, left behind by an earlier advanced civilization, and later Egyptians simply reused them. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin when it comes to the broader archaeological context. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, the cultural continuity of Egyptian architecture and the surrounding complex features make inheritance as a sweeping explanation less persuasive to most mainstream scholars. However, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask a better question. Could Egyptians have adopted ideas from elsewhere? Could cultural contact influence methods? That is a reasonable form of mystery because cultures do exchange knowledge. One interpretation is that Egypt's builders could have been aware of foreign techniques while still building within a distinctly Egyptian tradition. A more cautious explanation could be that external influence might affect details, but the overall project remains rooted in Egyptian state power and belief. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that ideas travel without changing who builds. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You walk again in your imagination. The sand is cool. The pyramid's shadow feels like a quiet boundary. You notice how your mind wants a single trick, a single missing element, a single hidden lever that makes the whole puzzle easy. That desire is human. It makes stories feel tidy. But the pyramid is not tidy. It is enormous. It is a mountain of small actions. Most historians agree that the impossible feeling often comes from compressing decades of labour into a single mental snapshot. Archaeology suggests that when time is expanded in your mind, the project becomes more plausible. The evidence we do have points to long duration work with repeated tasks. One interpretation is that if you imagine one crew lifting one block, it feels manageable. If you imagine thousands of crews doing it daily for years, the impossible becomes a schedule. And what if that is the real lesson of the pyramid, that monumental things are built by doing ordinary things for a very long time? Historians still argue whether we should think of the pyramid as a peak of efficiency or as a peak of ambition, because you can build something huge in a way that is not the most efficient, but is the most symbolically powerful. A more cautious explanation could be that some choices were made for meaning, not speed. That can include using certain stones, building to certain proportions, aligning to certain directions, and creating a shape that dominates the horizon. Now, because mystery content is popular, you also have to name the more extreme rumours without feeding them. A popular rumour claims that non-human helpers built the pyramids. This theory isn't widely accepted, and there is no solid evidence that requires it. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that when humans look at something that feels too big, they often look for a builder who feels bigger than human. But you do not need bigger than human. You need more human, not less. You need to picture a society with purpose, hierarchy, belief, and a river that feeds it. You need to picture labourers with sore shoulders, specialists with trained hands, scribes with careful counts, and administrators who wake up already stressed. That is the kind of human system that can build. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that practical methods can explain much of the process. The interpretation is how efficient the process was, and how much trial and error shaped it. The gentle imagination is you seeing modern disbelief as its own myth, a myth that says Ancient people were helpless until something mysterious intervened. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And tonight, what we can't confirm is the exact choreography of every day, every crew, every tweak. That uncertainty is real. It just doesn't automatically point to lost machines. It points to the limits of surviving evidence. You exhale slowly. You let the pyramid be both a monument and a mirror reflecting what humans believe about themselves. And you carry forward a clue that is always playful in its simplicity. Sometimes the most radical idea is that the ancient Egyptians were exactly what they appear to be in the evidence. You let that word capable settle into your chest like a warm stone. It's a steady feeling, not dramatic, and the pyramids seem to prefer steady feelings. They've had enough drama in their comment sections. Now you drift toward another question that comes up whenever people start doubting Egyptian authorship. If Egyptians built the pyramids, did they build them alone in an isolated bubble, or did they borrow trade, learn and adapt like every other human culture that has ever existed? Most historians agree that ancient Egypt was part of a wider world, connected through trade travel and contact with neighbouring regions. Archaeology suggests exchange of goods and ideas across the eastern Mediterranean and northeast Africa, and the evidence we do have points to cultural interaction rather than perfect isolation. This is mainstream ground, and it matters because it allows you to be both respectful of Egyptian achievement and realistic about how knowledge moves. One interpretation is that when people say someone else must have built the pyramids, they are often skipping over a more subtle possibility. Egyptians could have built them while still learning from shared human experience. A more cautious explanation could be that influences, if present, would likely show up in techniques, materials, or administrative habits, not in a sudden replacement of Egyptian builders with foreign miracle workers. And what if outsiders taught a trick or two without building the whole thing? You walk in your imagination toward the river again, because that's where contact happens. Boats mean movement. Movement means exchange. You smell wet reeds. You hear water lap softly against a hull. You picture cargo, copper, timber, stone, food, tools, luxury items. Most historians agree that Egypt imported certain materials it lacked, like high-quality timber. Archaeology suggests trade networks, and the evidence we do have points to Egypt engaging with its neighbours in practical ways. Here's your first light joke. You imagine an Egyptian official looking at a shipment of imported wood and thinking, great, now I can build the world's largest project, but I still have to deal with delivery delays. Ancient logistics is eternal. Now you return to building methods. Most historians agree that the development of pyramids shows a sequence of experimentation and refinement within Egypt. Archaeology suggests earlier structures and transitional designs indicate learning over time. The evidence we do have points to continuity in planning, stoneworking, and royal ideology. That continuity is one of the strongest mainstream reasons to attribute the pyramids to Egyptians. The pyramids do not appear like a sudden foreign object dropped into the timeline. They appear like an extreme outcome of a tradition. Historians still argue whether specific features in pyramid construction were influenced by ideas from outside Egypt, or whether they are independent developments, because influence can be hard to prove. One interpretation is that similar problems produce similar solutions. If multiple cultures need to move heavy stones, they might all invent ramps. If multiple cultures need to build tall, stable structures, they might all converge on certain shapes. A more cautious explanation could be that both things happen at once. Some ideas travel. Some ideas are reinvented. You imagine craftsmen exchanging tips the way modern workers do not through conferences, but through observation apprenticeship and the quiet borrowing of a good idea. Someone sees a better knot. Someone sees a better way to set a wedge. Someone sees a more efficient way to pack sand. And suddenly that method spreads like a rumour, except this rumour actually helps your back hurt less. Now this is also where more dramatic alternative theories like to camp out. A fringe idea proposes that an earlier unknown civilization built the pyramids, and Egyptians only inherited the structures or copied the idea. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin for a total replacement story. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The broader archaeological context, including related structures and Egyptian cultural patterns, makes it difficult to separate the pyramids completely from Egypt's own development. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can use it as a tool to think about evidence. What kind of signs would you need to see if a different civilization built the core structures? You would expect a mismatch in surrounding artifacts, a disconnect in building tradition, a sudden appearance without lead up and strong traces pointing elsewhere. Most historians agree that what we see instead is a connected pattern with earlier experiments and later variations that suggest an internal evolution. Still, historians still argue whether there are small gaps in that evolution, moments where the record is thinner and interpretation expands. That's normal. Archaeology is not a full movie. It's a scattered set of frames. One interpretation is that the missing frames invite imagination. A more cautious explanation could be that missing frames do not necessarily change the main story, but they can change our confidence in particular details. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible for the broad authorship to be mainstream, and likely while some specific influences or steps remain debated. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You stroll through a mental workshop again. You see tools, you see training, you see craft being passed down. Most historians agree that Egyptian craft traditions were strong and deeply embedded in society. Archaeology suggests specialized artisans existed, and the evidence we do have points to consistent stylistic and technical choices across monuments. That consistency supports the idea of local expertise rather than a sudden imported miracle. Here's your second light joke. You imagine a modern person insisting there must have been outside help, and an Egyptian artisan says, "Outside help? Yes. My apprentice is outside and he is not helping, he is hiding." Ancient apprentices also eternal. Now you also let yourself consider a softer, more interesting kind of outsider involvement. What if not in the form of builders, but in the form of ideas? Most historians agree that Egypt interacted with Nubia and the Near East, and archaeology suggests flows of goods and people. One interpretation is that those interactions could bring new materials, new measurement, habits, new administrative practices, or new design tastes. A more cautious explanation could be that even if such influences exist, the pyramid's core function and cultural meaning remain Egyptian, anchored in kingship, afterlife beliefs, and state power. Historians still argue whether the pyramids should be understood primarily as a culmination of Egyptian religious ideology or primarily as a political project dressed in religious language, because those two forces are entwined. One interpretation is that belief and politics reinforce each other. A more cautious explanation could be that the pyramid serves both, and that trying to separate them too neatly is a modern habit. Now you pause and look at the pyramid again, and you realise how easy it is for people to turn the authorship question into a contest, like someone must lose for someone else to win. But history is not a trophy ceremony. You can acknowledge exchange without erasing achievement. You can acknowledge debate without throwing away evidence. A popular rumour claims that outsiders not only influenced Egypt, but secretly controlled the project. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It tends to grow from the same human habit as other rumours. The habit of imagining that the biggest things must have the most dramatic hidden causes. A more cautious explanation could be that visible systems like agriculture administration and craft traditions are enough to explain what we see. And what if outsiders taught tricks without building the whole thing? That is a gentle what if, and it does not threaten mainstream history. It fits the ordinary pattern of human cultures where knowledge moves, adapts, and becomes local. You can picture an Egyptian foreman watching a traveller demonstrate a knot and thinking, I will pretend I invented this tomorrow. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Egypt interacted with neighbours through trade and contact. The interpretation is how much influence those contacts had on particular techniques. The gentle imagination is a quiet exchange of skills by the river, a shared human cleverness passing hand to hand. You keep walking. You keep breathing. You let the pyramid remain both Egyptian and human, rooted in a culture that was not isolated and therefore not limited to a single closed box of ideas. And you carry forward a clue that feels calming. The existence of contact does not weaken the case for Egyptian builders. It makes the story more realistic because realism includes exchange. You keep walking along the stone edge and the pyramid feels less like a single event and more like a long life. A monument is born and then it keeps living after the builders are gone. It sits through storms, through quiet centuries, through political changes, through new rulers who look at it and decide what it should mean to them. Most historians agree that the pyramids did not remain untouched after the Old Kingdom. because almost nothing in human history stays pristine when it is made of valuable stone and sits near a growing civilization. Archaeology suggests later activity around pyramid sites, including reuse of materials and maintenance work, and the evidence we do have points to the pyramids having afterlives that are just as human as their beginnings. You stand near a face of stone and imagine the smooth casing that once made the Great Pyramid shine. Now you picture hands centuries later prying those casing stones away, not out of malice, but out of practical need. One interpretation is that later people may have seen the pyramid less as a sacred finished object, and more as a convenient quarry of already cut, already dressed stone. And what if the pyramid's biggest enemy is not mystery but renovation? Here is your first light joke. You think about how in modern life someone will buy a historic house and immediately replace everything with grey flooring. You picture a medieval builder looking at the pyramid and thinking, wow, that is a lot of premium limestone, and I have a project due next week. Human beings have always been like this. What's broadly accepted is that over long periods, stones from older monuments can be reused for newer buildings, especially when those stones are high quality and close by. The evidence we do have points to a long history of stone robbing across many ancient sites, and the pyramids are not immune to the logic of convenience. Archaeology suggests that removing casing stones changes how the pyramid looks to us today, which matters because modern people often judge construction quality based on the exposed core, forgetting that it once wore a smoother skin. You let that settle because it changes the emotional tone. The pyramid is not just a triumph, it is also a survivor. It has been edited by time. Most historians agree that the Giza complex includes more than the big three pyramids, and that smaller structures, temples, causeways, and surrounding features also matter for understanding how the site functioned. Archaeology suggests these elements show planning and ritual use, and the evidence we do have points to a broader landscape shaped by multiple phases of activity. One interpretation is that when later dynasties or later communities interact with a site, they might repair some features while dismantling others, choosing what to preserve based on politics, religion and need. Historians still argue whether the later changes at Giza reflect mostly practical reuse, deliberate cultural curation, or a mix of both. You keep that exact phrase in your mind like a soft bell, because it gives you permission to hold more than one truth at once. People can respect a monument and also take stones from it. People can honour the past and also repurpose it. That contradiction is not a bug in history, it is the standard setting. You walk toward where a temple might have stood, and you picture later priests, later officials, later visitors stepping onto old stone. The site keeps receiving attention, sometimes reverent, sometimes opportunistic. Most historians agree that later periods in Egyptian history looked back on earlier times with a mix of pride and reinterpretation. Archaeology suggests ancient Egyptians themselves engage with the monuments of earlier kings, and the evidence we do have points to a relationship with the past that is not static, it shifts. One interpretation is that later rulers might use ancient monuments as political props, a way to borrow the aura of earlier greatness. A careful reading might suggest that restoration or reuse can be a form of propaganda. If a later king repairs an old temple, he is not only preserving it, he is also saying, I am the rightful heir of this tradition. And what if the past becomes a costume that each era tries on for size? Here is your second light joke. You imagine a later official giving a tour and saying, our kingdom has always been this stable, this organised, this glorious. Please ignore the pile of missing casing stones. It is a joke, but it also feels realistic because every government in every era loves a good continuity narrative. Now you let the mystery portion slip in, carefully framed. A popular rumour claims that the missing casing stones and altered site features prove the pyramids were not originally Egyptian at all, that Egyptians arrived later and simply occupied an older structure. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin for a total replacement story. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that long after lives naturally create confusing layers, and layers can look like contradictions if you treat the monument as a single frozen moment. You pause and you remember the feel of the sledge rope in your hands from your imagination, and the smell of bread at dawn. Those motifs are quiet anchors. They remind you that the pyramid begins in a human worksite, then it continues in human history. Most historians agree that ancient monuments often undergo repairs, modifications, and partial dismantling across centuries. Archaeology suggests signs of later interventions, including changes around entrances and the broader site, and the evidence we do have points to the pyramids being touched, reused, and reinterpreted. One interpretation is that the phrase built by Egyptians can be true in more than one sense. The core building can be Old Kingdom Egyptian. The ongoing shaping of what the pyramid becomes can be Egyptian across later dynasties too, and later non-Egyptian visitors as well. And what if built by Egyptians spanned centuries, not because the original build lasted centuries, but because the monument's life is a long chain of human choices? Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible to attribute the original construction to the Old Kingdom, while also recognizing that later generations change what survives and what we see. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now you picture a later scene. A quake, perhaps, or a gradual weakening in some area. A crack, a slump, a repair. Archaeology suggests that structures can show stress and change over time, and the evidence we do have points to ancient builders understanding maintenance, even if we don't have every record of every fix. Most historians agree that the very survival of massive stone structures involves both good initial design and the luck of not being dismantled completely. You walk along the base again and notice the rougher stones. You imagine how different it would look with casing with a smooth, shining face. A careful reading might suggest that some modern arguments about sloppy construction are really arguments about later loss. If you judge a monument after it has been stripped, you might misread the builders. Here is your third light joke. You think about how someone will look at an old car with missing hubcaps and conclude it was built badly. No, it was built fine. Someone stole the hubcaps. History is a vandal sometimes, and also a recycler. Now, because we promised a quirky tidbit in each section, you let one float through the night clearly labelled as mist. A fringe idea proposes that hidden caches of casing stones or hidden records still exist nearby, waiting to be found, and that one discovery could reshape how we picture the pyramid's original appearance. This theory isn't widely accepted as a firm prediction, but the general hope for new finds is reasonable because archaeology sometimes surprises us. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a calm reminder that not every question is closed. At the same time, you keep your footing. Most historians agree that the broad authorship and purpose of the pyramid complex fits Egyptian state culture and royal ideology. Archaeology suggests continuity in building traditions. The evidence we do have points to Egyptians building, maintaining, reusing, and reinterpreting their monuments over long stretches of time. One interpretation is that this long afterlife is part of why the authorship question keeps returning. When you see a monument that has been changed, you can feel tempted to imagine an original story that is totally different from what is accepted. But a more cautious explanation could be that the original story can remain mainstream and strong even when later layers complicate the surface. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that pyramids lose casing, get reused and experience long after lives shaped by later people. The interpretation is how to weigh reverence versus practicality in those later choices. The gentle imagination is you hearing distant footsteps across centuries, different shoes, different languages, but the same human habit of touching what is old and claiming it for the present. You breathe slowly and you let the pyramid be both ancient and ongoing, not a single moment but a long ripple of decisions, and you carry forward a clue that feels quietly important. When you ask, were they built by Egyptians, you are really asking about more than construction. You are asking about ownership across time, about how monuments survive, and about how history itself can reshape stone without moving a single block. You keep walking and the night feels even quieter now, like the whole plateau is listening with you. The pyramid's shadow stretches long and patient across the sand, and your thoughts settle into a calmer, more disciplined mood. This is the part of the journey where you stop chasing the most exciting story and start asking a gentler question. What can we test? What can we reasonably infer, and what has to remain in the fog? Most historians agree that the strongest way to understand a monument like this is not through one perfect clue, but through many smaller clues that point in the same direction. Archaeology suggests that physical context matters deeply, and the evidence we do have points to Egyptian authorship through patterns of quarrying tools, site organisation, and cultural continuity. That is mainstream ground, and it is more solid than any single dramatic claim. Historians still argue whether certain specific details of construction, such as the precise ramp configuration or the full internal planning sequence, can be reconstructed with high confidence. You let that exact phrase ring once like a soft bell, because it acknowledges both what we know and what we don't know without turning uncertainty into panic. There's no need for panic. You are not doing a quiz. You are easing into sleep. Now you begin a quiet sorting process in your mind. Documented anchors, interpreted connections, and imagined mood, all kept separate even as they blend gently in the narration. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The documented anchors are the things that leave traces, quarry scars, tool marks, settlement patterns, the consistent cultural tradition of monumental building in Egypt, the design logic of internal chambers. Most historians agree those anchors exist and are meaningful. Archaeology suggests they fit a coherent picture of Egyptian state capability. The interpreted connections are where you have to walk carefully. How large the workforce was at any exact moment, how the labour was experienced socially, exactly how ramps shifted in different phases, exactly which survey method was used on which night. One interpretation is that multiple solutions could work, and builders might have used whatever was practical at each stage. A more cautious explanation could be that reconstructions can be plausible without being final, and that the best scholars are often the ones most comfortable saying, "This is likely but not fully confirmed." Let me rephrase that more carefully. A strong historical case does not require perfect detail in every corner. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now, the imagined mood is what you are doing right now. Standing here in your mind, letting the stones and stars and wind turn evidence into feeling. Imagined mood is not proof, and it doesn't need to be. It is simply the way your brain makes sense of time. Here is your first light joke. You imagine history as a roommate who refuses to label leftovers. You open the fridge and ask, "What is this?" And history says, "It's a possibility, not a certainty. Good luck." That is basically the archaeology experience in one sentence. Now you address the big modern confusion gently. People sometimes think that if any piece of the story is debated, then everything is up for grabs. But that is not how careful reasoning works. Most historians agree that broad frameworks can be strong even when certain details remain debated. Archaeology suggests you can hold uncertainty at the edges without losing the centre. The evidence we do have points strongly toward Egyptians building the pyramids, even if the exact step-by-step choreography is not fully pinned down. One interpretation is that some mystery theories grow from a reasonable impulse, the impulse to challenge assumptions and demand evidence. That impulse can be healthy. A more cautious explanation could be that the impulse becomes unhelpful when it treats gaps as permission to insert any conclusion, especially the most dramatic one. And what if uncertainty is not a doorway to wild certainty, but a quiet reminder to stay humble? Now, because we promised a quirky or fringe tidbit, you let one appear carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that there is a single missing piece of evidence, a lost record or an undiscovered space that would either confirm every mainstream claim or overturn everything. This theory isn't widely accepted in that extreme form, because history rarely offers one magical key. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But it captures a real longing, the longing for closure. Historians still argue whether future discoveries are more likely to refine the mainstream picture or to radically rewrite it. You let that hang for a moment because it is an honest debate about expectations. One interpretation is that new evidence often fills in details rather than flipping the whole table. A more cautious explanation could be that while surprises happen, they usually land within the boundaries of what is already plausible. It's possible, for example, that new evidence could clarify workforce, organisation, transport routes, or internal features without changing the overall authorship. Let me rephrase that more carefully. New finds might support the idea that Egyptians built the pyramids while also reshaping our understanding of how they did it. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now you think about why the authorship question keeps returning. Most historians agree that the pyramids are unusually good at triggering wonder because they are both simple and enormous, a triangle, a mountain, a geometry you can draw on paper, and yet the scale is beyond casual comprehension. Archaeology suggests that when scale overwhelms intuition, people look for extraordinary explanations. The evidence we do have points to human methods, but human methods at extreme scale can feel like magic. Here is your second light joke. You think about how you can watch a time lapse of someone building a Lego castle and it looks like it assembles itself. Then you realise the time lapse is just someone working for hours. The pyramid is the ultimate time lapse, we just don't have the video. Now you let the story become a little more personal because bedtime history works best when it makes you feel included. You imagine yourself holding a measuring rod, watching a shadow line, hearing a foreman call out. You imagine the scribe counting bread, the carpenter fixing a sledge runner, the water carrier refilling jars. These are not dramatic scenes, they are the scenes that make the mainstream story plausible. One interpretation is that the pyramid is a monument to routine. A more cautious explanation could be that routine alone is not enough. You also need motivation, ideology, and authority to sustain routine at that scale. And what if the pyramid is a human agreement written in stone, an agreement that this king's eternal stability is worth everyone's temporary strain? Now, because you are keeping monetization safe, you also calmly name the boundaries. A popular rumour claims that mainstream archaeology is hiding the truth about pyramid origins. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin for a coordinated cover-up on that scale. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that disagreement and debate are visible precisely because scholars argue in public, publish competing interpretations, and critique each other. The existence of debate is not proof of secrecy. It is proof that uncertainty is taken seriously. Historians still argue whether some disputed claims persist mostly because of missing evidence or mostly because of modern storytelling incentives. That debate matters because stories travel faster than slow, careful explanations. One interpretation is that mystery sells. A more cautious explanation could be that mystery also comforts because it gives you a sense that the world has hidden depth. And what if the healthiest version of mystery is the version that admits its own limits, the version that says, we're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the converging evidence for Egyptian building. The interpretation is the exact details of method and social texture. The gentle imagination is you standing here under stars, feeling the pyramid as both answer and question, a calm reminder that human capability can look like myth when time has sanded down the footprints. You slow your pace. You let the wind soften. You carry forward a final clue before the last section. The strongest story is not the loudest story. The strongest story is the one that can hold evidence, debate, and wonder all at once without turning any of them into a weapon. You stay in that quiet, disciplined mood, and the plateau seems to reward you for it. The wind is softer now, or maybe your mind is softer, which has the same effect. The pyramid is still there, still immense, but it feels less like a challenge and more like a companion, a silent shape that lets you think without interrupting. This is where you bring the question home, not with a drum roll, but with a balanced exhale. Were the pyramids truly built by the Egyptians? Most historians agree that the strongest answer, based on the evidence we do have, is yes, the pyramids at Giza fit Egyptian Old Kingdom culture organisation and building tradition. Archaeology suggests a coherent web of clues from the landscape and quarrying logic to tools, workforce, infrastructure, and the wider sequence of pyramid development. The evidence we do have points to Egyptians planning and carrying out the project, even if we cannot confirm every step in the daily choreography. Historians still argue whether certain specific details, such as the exact ramp configurations or the full meaning of every internal feature, can be pinned down with complete confidence. You let that sentence sit there gently because it is important. It protects you from the trap of turning a strong mainstream conclusion into an overconfident slogan. It also protects you from the opposite trap, the trap of saying, if we don't know everything, we know nothing. Neither trap is good for sleep. One interpretation is that the pyramid's enduring power comes from this balance. It is explainable enough to be human, but uncertain enough in details to remain a puzzle. A more cautious explanation could be that the puzzle is not a single missing secret, but many small missing mundane facts, the kind of facts that would feel ordinary if we had them. And what if the monument is not hiding a hidden truth so much as it is hiding 1,000 missing workdays? You imagine those workdays not as a montage, but as a steady calendar of mornings. Bread at dawn, a sledge being repaired, rope being checked, a foreman calling out counts, sand being wetted, stones inching forward, survey lines being checked. That recurring sledge motif returns one last time along with the smell of bread, because those are your anchors, your way of keeping the story human. Here is your first light joke. You realise that if the ancient builders could see modern debates, they might be confused. They would probably say, yes, we built it, and also, could you please stop using the phrase ancient energy device? It makes us tired. Now, because your balance rule demands it, you acknowledge the mystery theories calmly without letting them take the wheel. A popular rumour claims that outsiders or non-human forces built the pyramids. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A more cautious explanation could be that the awe of the pyramid makes humans reach for a builder who feels larger than life. But the simplest consistent story is often the most plausible. A fringe idea proposes that the pyramids were built by Egyptians, but under the guidance of a lost, advanced wisdom tradition. This theory isn't widely accepted as a broad rewrite, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can be reframed into something more reasonable. Knowledge travels, techniques evolve, people learn. One interpretation is that Egyptians could have absorbed ideas from the world around them while still being the builders. A more cautious explanation could be that the core development of pyramid building shows strong local continuity. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible for influences to exist without changing the main authorship. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now you also honour the emotional side of the question. People ask, were Egyptians the builders? Because the answer carries meaning. It is about respect. It is about whether ancient people are allowed to be brilliant without being supernatural. Most historians agree that ancient societies can be extraordinarily capable. Archaeology suggests Egyptians had the resources, skills and motives for monumental building. The evidence we do have points to a real human achievement, and recognising that achievement is part of being honest with the past. Historians still argue whether modern portrayals have underestimated the sophistication of Egyptian administration and engineering, because popular culture often prefers mystery to paperwork. Here is your second light joke. You imagine the pyramids being built not by magic, but by the ancient equivalent of a stern project manager who says, "I do not care about your feelings, the stones must be placed by sunset." It is funny, but it is also true that large projects live or die by management. Now you take one more look upward. The pyramid's silhouette is calm. The stars are steady. The idea that the pyramid is aligned, measured and built into a landscape feels less like a riddle and more like a statement. A statement that says we belong in a world with order, with direction, with continuity. One interpretation is that this is why the pyramid still works on your imagination. It is geometry made emotional. A more cautious explanation could be that even if we can explain the mechanics, we cannot fully recover the feeling of living in that belief system. And what if the deepest mystery is not how the stones moved, but how belief moved people? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Egyptians had plausible methods, organization and cultural reasons. The interpretation is the exact mechanics, the precise social texture, and the meaning of certain features. The gentle imagination is you standing here at night, letting the monument feel like a calm question rather than a battlefield. And now, because this is bedtime history, you let the pacing slow further. You stop trying to hold every detail in your mind. You let the facts you need stay close, and the facts you don't need drift away like sand in wind. You breathe in, you breathe out. The pyramid remains, but the urgency does not. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues, and the clue that matters most is simple. Most historians agree Egyptians built the pyramids. Archaeology suggests human systems explain the feat. The evidence we do have points to that. Historians still argue whether certain details will ever be fully confirmed, and that is okay. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And there is room in that quiet uncertainty for wonder without distortion. Now the wind down begins soft and slow, like the last minutes before sleep, when your thoughts loosen their grip. You imagine yourself sitting on the sand, a little distance from the stones. The ground is cool but not uncomfortable. The air is mild. Somewhere far away a night bird makes a small sound, and then silence returns. The pyramid is a dark triangle against a deep sky, and you stop asking it to answer you. You simply let it exist. In your mind, the work site appears one last time, but it is gentler now. There is no shouting, no counting, no strain. There is just the idea of people long ago moving through their lives. You see a water jar catching the light. You see a hand smoothing a rope. You smell bread again warm and faint. You hear the soft scrape of a sledge runner on sand, a sound that feels like a lullaby when you remove the effort and keep only the rhythm. You let the solid ground stay solid. Egyptians capable and organised building with tools and patience and belief. You let the mist stay mist. Debated details, missing records, unknown small choices, questions that may never have a final line under them, and you let your imagination be gentle, not demanding, not loud, just curious and calm. You breathe in slowly, and you picture the stars turning above the plateau, the way they always have, quiet and indifferent and steady. You breathe out, and you let the pyramid's shadow soften in your mind, as if the edges blur just a little, not because the monument changes, but because you are drifting and your brain is doing what it was built to do at night. There's no need to solve everything. There's no need to pick a single dramatic secret. You can let the answer be strong and simple, and you can let the remaining questions be soft and open. You can let wonder be a warm blanket, not a sharp hook. And as you settle, you allow one last thought to pass through, slow and kind. What if the real gift of the pyramids is that they teach you to respect human effort across time, and then to let it go the way you let a long day go, the way you let your muscles unclench, the way you let your eyes close. The wind keeps moving, the sand keeps resting, the stones keep holding the night. You keep breathing slower now, quieter now, until even the question itself feels like it has fallen asleep.